The morning my husband walked away from our marriage, he left his wedding ring on a coffee shop table at O'Hare International Airport, like it was a receipt he no longer needed. He had been adjusting the collar of his coat when I said the words I had been carrying for weeks. "You are going to regret this trip." He looked at me with the particular amusement of a man who has already decided he is the smartest person in the room, slipped the ring off his finger without ceremony, and set it on the table between us. "Really," he said, "I am not even coming back." Then he picked up his suitcase and walked away, and the woman he had been seeing for months fell into step beside him, and neither of them looked back, and I stood there watching until they disappeared into the crowd and the airport noise swallowed them whole. If you have ever been the person in a relationship who held everything together quietly, invisibly, without recognition or acknowledgement, and watched someone walk away convinced they had built it all themselves, I want you to stay with me through every moment of this story, because what happened next changed everything I thought I understood about patience, preparation, and what it actually means to know your own worth. Subscribe right now so you do not miss a single part of what comes, and drop one word in the comments that describes how it feels when someone who should know you better than anyone treats your loyalty like it has no limit. I read every single one, and I want to know how many of us have been standing in that airport. My name is Nora Whitfield. I was 42 years old, living in Naperville, Illinois, in a house with a wraparound porch and a lake property in Wisconsin, and a financial portfolio that my husband Callum had spent years believing he understood. I worked as a financial consultant, the kind of work that requires equal parts analytical precision and the ability to see patterns that other people miss. And I was very good at it, in the way that people who have spent years quietly managing complexity are always good at their jobs. I had been married to Callum Whitfield for 18 years, together for nearly 20, and for most of that time I had been the person who made things work without anyone noticing that things were being made to work. That invisibility had once felt like a form of love. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that it was actually a form of erasure. Callum had built a successful career in commercial real estate sales over the course of our marriage, and he had done it with genuine effort and real skill, and I had admired both of those things for a long time. When we met in our mid-20s, he was the kind of man who made you believe in ambition. He had energy and confidence and dreams that seemed larger than the small apartment above a dry cleaner where we spent our first years together, the one where the plumbing rattled whenever the neighbors showered, and cold air slipped through the windows no matter how many towels we stuffed underneath them. Those years were genuinely happy. We worked hard and planned carefully, and sacrificed things we wanted now for things we wanted later, and slowly the world we had imagined began to take shape. A first house, then a larger one, then the lake property in Wisconsin that my father had always said was the kind of investment that appreciated quietly and rewarded patience. From the outside, we looked like one of those families featured in magazine advertisements. Successful, stable, complete. The truth was considerably more complicated. The change in Callum happened gradually, the way most damaging things do, disguised as something reasonable, until it has already become something else entirely. At first, he simply became busier, which made sense because his career was growing. Then busier became distant, which I attributed to stress. Then distant became dismissive, which I attributed to a difficult season. Then dismissive became something I no longer had a comfortable word for. His cruelty was never physical. It was more sophisticated than that, the kind that leaves no visible marks and therefore cannot be easily named. He interrupted me whenever I spoke in front of other people. He rolled his eyes when I expressed concerns about anything he had already decided. He acted as though every achievement in our shared life belonged to him alone, as though the house and the investments and the lifestyle had materialized through his effort exclusively. If someone complimented our home, he talked about how hard he had worked for it. If someone admired our financial position, he described his career trajectory. Rarely, almost never, did he mention the countless hours I had spent managing our finances, overseeing investment accounts, handling tax filings, researching opportunities, negotiating with vendors, and quietly protecting a future he was too busy taking credit for to actually understand. For years I told myself that marriages had seasons, that the distance was temporary, that the man I had married was still somewhere inside the man he had become. Then one evening, about 6 months before everything finally collapsed, I found the first undeniable proof. Callum had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a message appeared on the screen that no wife should ever have to read. I stood there for a long moment, very still, the way you stand when your body understands something before your mind is ready to accept it. The woman's name was Petra Slade. She worked in his office. She was younger than him by nearly 15 years. The relationship was not new. It had been going on for months, possibly longer, and the messages I read in those few seconds before I set the phone back down exactly where I had found it told me everything I needed to know about how little I had been seeing clearly. I remember sitting alone in my car outside a grocery store the following afternoon, watching rain tap softly against the windshield, and making a decision that would change everything. I could have confronted him immediately. Most people would have. Instead, I got very quiet, and I started preparing. I met with an attorney named Diane Marsh, whose office was nothing like I had imagined. No dramatic courtroom photographs, no towering bookshelves, just a warm receptionist and a woman who listened without interrupting and asked exactly the right questions. Then I met with a second attorney to confirm what the first had told me. Then I began reviewing everything: account statements, property records, investment documents, retirement funds, insurance policies, every financial detail of our shared life laid out in front of me with the methodical focus I brought to complex consulting projects. The deeper I looked, the more something became painfully clear. Callum had spent years believing he understood our financial situation. He did not. Not even close. The family home had been purchased using funds from an inheritance my parents left me. Documented and traceable, and entirely legal. The lake property in Wisconsin was solely in my name. Had always been solely in my name. Because my father had insisted on that structure when he helped me acquire it years before our marriage. Several significant investment accounts had originated from assets I inherited before Callum and I ever met. Everything was transparent. Everything was documented. Callum simply had never paid attention, because why would he? For years he had assumed I would always be there managing things behind the scenes, the way a stage crew manages a production. Nobody notices the stage crew until the lights stop working. The months that followed changed me in ways I had not anticipated. Not because I became harder, but because I became honest with myself in ways I had been avoiding for years. I stopped trying to save a marriage that only one person was interested in saving. I stopped making excuses for behavior that did not deserve excuses. I stopped protecting Callum from consequences he had earned. Meanwhile, he became increasingly bold, spending more nights away from home, offering fewer explanations, making less effort to maintain even the appearance of a functioning marriage. By the time summer arrived, he was barely trying. Then came the morning at O'Hare, and the ring on the table, and the words I had been carrying for weeks, finally spoken aloud. "You are going to regret this trip." He laughed. He actually laughed, and then he left. As I walked toward the parking garage, my phone buzzed with a message from Diane. Everything was ready. The paperwork could be filed at any time. I stared at the screen for several seconds, watching a plane cross the morning sky. Somewhere inside it, my husband convinced he was flying toward freedom. Then I typed 4 words. "Go ahead, file it." The morning after Callum left, I slept better than I had in months. That surprised me. I had expected grief, maybe panic, the particular disorientation of a life suddenly rearranged. Instead, I woke at 7, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen island while sunlight poured through the windows, and the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had finally exhaled after holding their breath for years. I was halfway through answering emails when my phone began ringing. Callum's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a moment, then answered. The voice on the other end barely sounded like him. It was shaking in a way I had never heard before. Not angry, not irritated, genuinely frightened. He told me his credit cards were not working. Every single one of them. The hotel had declined payment. The rental car company had called. Something was wrong with the accounts. I looked out the window at the backyard, where a squirrel was running along the fence with the focused indifference of a creature that had no interest in anyone's financial situation. I took a sip of coffee. "Nothing is wrong with the accounts," I said. "Then why can he not access them?" "Because they are not his accounts anymore." The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when someone's entire understanding of their situation collapses at once. I kept my voice calm, the same calm I had practiced with Diane across multiple meetings, the calm of someone who has prepared carefully and is now simply watching preparation become reality. I told him the joint accounts had been legally separated. He asked what that meant. I told him I had filed for divorce the previous day. The string of curses that followed was loud enough that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and when it finally ended, I remained silent, because I had learned that silence was more effective than any response I could have offered. Eventually, he asked whether I had planned it. I told him I had prepared for it, which was not the same thing. He accused me of waiting until he left the country. I told him I had waited until he made his choice. Then he asked the question I had been expecting, the question that told me everything I needed to know about what he was actually worried about. Not the marriage, not the 18 years, not the woman he had left behind. "How much money did you move?" There it was. I told him that money belonging to me remained where it belonged, and I listened to him try to process what that meant. And I heard Petra's voice in the background asking questions in the anxious tone of someone beginning to realize the luxury vacation she had been promised might not materialize as advertised. Over the next 10 minutes, Callum discovered one surprise after another, each one arriving in the particular sequence of a man opening files on his phone, while his world rearranges itself around him. The house. He found the property records, and his voice became very small. "Why is your name the only name on this?" he asked. I told him it had always been that way. "That is impossible," he said. I told him it was documented. He sounded genuinely shocked, not because anything improper had occurred, but because he had never once bothered to look. Then the lake property, then the investment accounts, then the inherited assets, each one documented, each one traceable, each one exactly where it had always been. Nothing was hidden, nothing was secret. The only difference was that he was finally looking, and what he found was a financial picture that looked nothing like the one he had been carrying in his head for years. At one point his anger returned, accusations of deception and manipulation and revenge arriving in the familiar tone of a man who had spent years treating his own assumptions as facts. I listened patiently. Then I asked him one simple question. "Did you ever once ask to review our financial records?" He did not answer. We both knew why. He never had. Confidence had replaced curiosity, and arrogance had replaced responsibility, and now reality was presenting the bill for both. 2 days later, a notification arrived from a travel rewards account we had shared. A new flight reservation. 1 passenger, Petra Slade. Departure the following morning. Different destination, different itinerary, no return flight with Callum. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then slowly closed my laptop. The fantasy he had built his departure around was already beginning to crack, and he had not yet seen the worst of what was coming. 3 days after the first phone call, he called again, shortly after dinner, on a summer evening, when I was sitting on the back patio watching the sky turn orange and gold over the Illinois rooftops. His voice sounded hollow, in a way that was different from the panic of the first call. This was something quieter. "She is gone," he said. I already knew who he meant. She booked a flight and left that morning. I looked out at the old maple tree, swaying gently in the evening breeze, and said nothing for a moment, because there was not much to say. Petra was not the cause of our marriage ending. She was the symptom of a much larger problem, and her departure was simply reality arriving on its own schedule. Then Callum said something that landed in the air between us, with the particular weight of a sentence spoken by someone who has not yet understood how it sounds. "I thought she loved me." The words were sad and childish and almost unbelievable, coming from a man who had convinced himself he was living a grand romantic story while leaving destruction behind him. I told him she had barely known him. He laughed, a bitter sound, the kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they have been avoiding. "Maybe you are right," he said. "Maybe." That word surprised me more than anything else he had said, because for years certainty had been his native language, and now everything had become maybe. The conversation drifted for several minutes, and for the first time in a long time he was not trying to win anything. He simply sounded tired. Then he asked a question I had not expected. "Did you ever stop loving me?" I leaned back in my chair and thought about it honestly, because the question deserved honesty. People imagine love disappearing all at once, like a light switched off. In reality, it often fades gradually, 1 degree at a time, like sunlight at the end of a long day. "I do not think so," I said. He was quiet. Then I continued. "I think I stopped recognizing the person you became." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered whether the call had disconnected. Finally he spoke. "I do not know when everything changed. I did, but explaining it would not have accomplished anything. Marriages rarely collapse because of one dramatic event. They collapse because of thousands of small decisions, thousands of moments when one person chooses themselves over the relationship, thousands of opportunities to show kindness or respect or gratitude and chooses not to. That was what happened to us. Not overnight, over years. If you are still with me right now, I want you to pause for just a moment, because what comes next is the part of this story that I think matters most. Subscribe if you have not already, because the most important moments are still ahead. And drop a comment telling me about the moment you realized someone in your life had been taking you for granted without ever seeing it clearly. It does not have to be a marriage. It can be a friendship, a family, a workplace. I want to know the moment the pattern finally became impossible to ignore, because I think more of us have been in that position than anyone talks about openly. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm that surprised me with how quickly it felt natural. The divorce process continued with the methodical efficiency of a legal system designed to handle exactly this kind of situation. Lawyers exchanged documents, financial disclosures were completed, paperwork moved through the system exactly as it was designed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just reality proceeding at its own pace. Meanwhile, Willa visited more often. Our daughter was 21 and finishing her final year of college, and she had handled the news of the divorce with a maturity that both impressed and saddened me. One afternoon we were sitting together at a coffee shop downtown, when she looked up from her drink and said something that stopped me completely. "I knew Dad was cheating," she said. I nearly dropped my cup. "You did?" She nodded. "For months." My stomach tightened. "Why did you not say anything?" She looked down at her drink, then gave a small, sad shrug. "Because I thought you already knew." The answer hit me harder than I expected, because it meant she had been carrying that knowledge alone, protecting me from something she assumed I had already seen. Children notice more than parents realize. Far more. Willa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You deserve better, Mom." Simple words, yet they nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because I needed validation, but because hearing them reminded me how much of my life I had spent accepting less than I deserved, and how long it had taken me to stop. Something unexpected happened over those months. I started enjoying my life again, not in a dramatic way, but in the ordinary ways that turn out to matter most. I joined a weekend hiking group and discovered I genuinely loved being outside in a way I had forgotten. I reconnected with friends I had let drift during years of managing someone else's priorities. I took a short trip to Colorado and spent 3 days doing exactly what I wanted without consulting anyone's schedule. I started accepting consulting projects I had previously turned down because they conflicted with Callum's expectations of my availability. Little by little, the world became larger. For years, my life had revolved around managing crises created by someone else's ego. Without that burden, I suddenly had energy for myself, and the contrast was so striking that I sometimes stopped in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and simply noticed how different it felt to exist without the constant low-level weight of someone else's entitlement pressing down on everything. The contrast became even more striking whenever Callum called, and he continued calling, with a regularity that told me he was still trying to understand what had happened to him. Each conversation revealed another piece of the reality he was navigating. The financial picture he had always assumed was clear turned out to be far more complicated than he had imagined. and the investments he believed belonged equally to both of them had origins he had never bothered to trace. He was not broke, not even close, but he was not nearly as wealthy as he had believed, and that realization seemed to shake something fundamental in him. Then came the professional complications. At first they were subtle, a delayed opportunity here, a partnership that cooled unexpectedly there, a client who became difficult to reach. Nothing catastrophic, just a pattern that continued. One evening he told me that people were treating him differently, and he could not understand why. I did not answer, because I already knew. Years earlier, my father Warren Aldridge had quietly introduced Callum to several influential people in his industry. Not because Callum asked, because Warren wanted to support our family, the way he supported everything he cared about, quietly and without expectation of recognition. Many of those introductions had evolved into opportunities. Many opportunities had evolved into the career Callum believed he had built entirely alone. Now those same connections were fading, not because anyone was punishing him, but because relationships require maintenance and gratitude, and both were qualities Callum had neglected for years. The most painful moment came near the end of summer. Callum called late one evening, and his voice sounded defeated in a way that was different from everything that had come before. Not angry, not frightened, just defeated, as though something inside him had finally stopped resisting the truth. Then he said something I had not expected to hear. I threw away the wrong person. The words lingered between us, heavy and honest and too late. I closed my eyes. For a brief moment I felt sorrow. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just the particular sorrow of someone watching another person finally understand something that could no longer be changed. Because by then, I knew something Callum was only beginning to discover. The hardest consequences were not financial. They were not legal. They were not professional. The hardest consequence was realizing that the people who genuinely loved you are often invisible until they are gone, and that by the time you finally see them clearly, it may already be too late to do anything with that clarity. One Saturday morning in autumn, I was cleaning out a closet upstairs when I found an old photo album. I sat on the floor and began turning pages. Callum at 25, standing beside our first apartment. The two of us holding newborn Willa in the hospital, both of us looking terrified and completely in love with her simultaneously. Family vacations, birthday parties, camping trips, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper covering every surface. For a while I simply looked, not crying, not smiling, just remembering. People often assume that moving on requires erasing the past, treating it as something contaminated that must be discarded entirely. I found the opposite to be true. Healing comes from accepting the past for what it actually was, both the good and the bad, without needing to revise either. Callum had hurt me. That was true. But it was also true that we had once built something real together, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. A few days later he called again, and the conversation eventually shifted to a question that surprised me. Did your father ever help me get my first regional account? I paused. Yes, I told him. Silence. Then, I thought I earned that on my own. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard covered in fallen leaves, and thought about my father for a moment. A good man, a humble man, the kind of person who helped others quietly and never expected recognition or credit. You did earn it, I said. What do you mean? My father opened a door. You walked through it. Another silence. But opening doors matters too. That seemed to land somewhere important, because what Callum had been discovering over recent months was not that his accomplishments were false. They were not. He had worked hard and developed real skills and built genuine relationships. The problem was that he had rewritten history in his own mind over the years, erasing every person who had helped him along the way, turning every shared success into a personal victory, until the version of himself he believed in had almost no connection to the actual story of how he had gotten where he was. Now he was being forced to confront a more honest version of that story, and it was not comfortable. Around the same time, I received a call from Garrison Holt, a longtime family friend who had known both Callum and me for nearly 20 years. After a few minutes of conversation, he hesitated, then told me that Callum had reached out asking for help connecting with a client. Garrison had declined. He seemed shocked when I declined, Garrison said, and I could hear the quiet sadness in his voice. Then his tone became more serious. You know what I think happened? What? For years he thought relationships were transactions. I remained silent. Now he is learning they are investments. After hanging up, I thought about that sentence for a long time. Relationships are investments, not financial ones, but human ones, built through consistency and trust and respect and gratitude. And you cannot neglect them for years and expect them to remain unchanged. The same principle applies to marriages and friendships and families and every connection that matters. Everything worthwhile requires maintenance. That was the lesson Callum was learning, slowly and expensively, in the way that lessons learned too late always arrive. Around Thanksgiving, Willa came home for the holiday, and we spent most of the day cooking together in the kitchen. Nothing elaborate, just the usual American tradition of turkey and mashed potatoes and green beans and pumpkin pie, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that smells like something good is happening. At one point she looked around and smiled. "You seem happier," she said. "Is it that obvious?" "Very." Her answer was immediate. Then she became thoughtful. "After Dad left, I worried you would become bitter." I stirred the gravy while considering her words. "Honestly, I worried about that too," I told her, and then I smiled. I realized bitterness would give him power he does not deserve. Willa nodded as though she had been hoping for exactly that answer. The truth was that revenge had changed meaning for me over those months. At first I had wanted consequences, fairness, reality catching up with someone who had been avoiding it for years. And it did catch up. But eventually I discovered something more satisfying than consequences. Freedom. Real freedom. The freedom to stop organizing my life around someone else's mistakes. The freedom to stop carrying resentment like furniture I had forgotten I could put down. The freedom to move forward into a life that was entirely mine. That winter, my consulting business expanded in ways I had not anticipated. A former colleague offered a partnership opportunity that I accepted without hesitation. Several new clients came aboard. For the first time in years, I felt professionally energized in the way that work becomes energizing when it is finally proportional to what you are actually capable of. One snowy evening in January, nearly 10 months after Callum had left for Europe, he called again. The divorce was almost finalized. Most major issues had already been resolved. His voice sounded tired and older somehow, as though the year had compressed something in him. Then he said he owed me an apology. I remained quiet, not because I did not want to hear it, but because I wanted him to continue without interruption, without excuses, without the qualifications that had always arrived before. And he did. For several minutes he talked. Not about money or legal settlements or Petra, but about himself. His arrogance, his selfishness, his entitlement, the way he had taken people for granted, the way he had treated loyalty as something automatic and permanent and guaranteed, as though the people who loved him were fixtures rather than choices. When he finally finished, neither of us spoke for a while. Then I asked quietly whether he meant it. "Yes," he said, immediately, without hesitation, without performance. For the first time in years, I believed him, not because he wanted something, because he had finally stopped pretending. A little over a year after Callum walked away from our marriage, I found myself standing in the ballroom of a charity fundraising event in downtown Chicago. The room was elegant without being extravagant, round tables filling the space, conversations drifting through the air, a jazz trio playing softly near the stage. Business leaders and nonprofit directors and community volunteers mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, and I was speaking with a client when I noticed movement near the entrance. A familiar figure had just walked in. For a second, I almost did not recognize him. Then I did. Callum. He looked older, not dramatically, just different in the particular way of someone who has spent a year being honest with himself for the first time. His posture had changed. The edge of arrogance that had once defined the way he moved through a room was gone, replaced by something quieter, humility, and perhaps a little regret. He had not seen me yet. I turned my attention back to the conversation and continued speaking naturally. A year earlier, his presence in the same room would have ruined my evening. Now it barely changed it. That realization surprised me, because healing is not measured by how much anger you still feel. It is measured by how little control the past still has over you. About 20 minutes later, I felt someone approach. I turned. Callum stood there, looking nervous, in a way that was almost unrecognizable on him. This was the same man who had once boarded an international flight, believing he held all the power. Now he seemed unsure of every word. "You look good," he said. "Thank you. You really do." I smiled politely. "So do you." It was not entirely true. He looked tired, but he looked healthier emotionally than he had during the darkest months after our separation. And in a strange way, the suffering had made him more human. "Can we talk for a minute?" I considered it, then nodded. We moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Chicago's skyline glowing against the night sky. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. Then Callum broke the silence. "I almost did not come tonight," he said. "Why?" He gave a small laugh. "I heard you might be here." I raised an eyebrow, and I was not sure you would want to see me. The old version of Callum never would have worried about that. The old version assumed his presence was welcome everywhere. This version understood consequences. "I do not mind seeing you," I said. His expression softened. Then he nodded. "I guess that is more kindness than I deserve." For several seconds we stood quietly. Then he surprised me. "I wanted to thank you," he said. I blinked. "For what?" He looked down briefly before answering. "For not trying to destroy me." The statement hung between us. Interesting, because there had been a time when he genuinely believed I was trying to ruin his life. Now he understood something different. The consequences he had suffered were not created by me. They were created by him. I had simply stopped protecting him from them. "I was not interested in destroying you," I said. "I know that now," he said. His voice was quiet. I did not know it then. The honesty felt real. No manipulation, no strategy, just truth. A year ago, that would have mattered more. Now it simply felt peaceful. "I spent months blaming you," he admitted. "For everything." I remained silent. "I blamed you for the divorce." He laughed softly. "I blamed you for my financial situation." Another small laugh. "I even blamed you when Petra left." That one almost made me smile. Eric shook his head. "Eventually I ran out of people to blame." The statement carried more wisdom than he probably realized, because many people spend their entire lives avoiding responsibility, and very few develop the courage to confront themselves honestly. When that happened, he continued, I started seeing things differently. I nodded and waited. "I realized something," he said. "What?" He looked directly at me. "The worst thing I lost was not the money." I said nothing. It was not the house. Again, silence. It was not the business opportunities. His voice grew quieter. It was the person who spent 18 years believing in me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The ballroom noise faded into the background. And there it was. The truth. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just simple and devastating and too late. I felt sadness, but not the kind that breaks you. The kind that reminds you that life is complicated, that people make terrible mistakes, and that sometimes they only understand those mistakes after the damage is permanent. Before we reach the final moment of this story, I want you to do something. Share this video with one person in your life who needs to hear it. Someone who has been the invisible one for too long. Someone who has been holding things together without recognition or acknowledgement. And drop a comment telling me what you would say to the person who underestimated you. If you could say anything at all, not what you wish you had said in the moment, what you would say now, from the other side of it, from the place where you finally know your own worth. I will read every single one. "I am sorry, Claire," he said. This time the apology landed differently, not because it was more eloquent, but because it no longer carried expectations. He was not asking for another chance. He was not asking me to come back. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was simply telling the truth, and truth has a certain weight to it that performance never achieves. I nodded. "Thank you." A small smile appeared on his face. You know, he said, for a long time I thought your warning at the airport was a threat. I laughed softly. It was not. I know, he said. His smile widened slightly. It was a prediction. For the first time all evening, we both laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the observation was accurate, and we both knew it. And there was something almost peaceful in that shared recognition. A year earlier I had told him he would regret that trip. Not because I had planned revenge. Not because I intended to punish him. Because I understood something he did not. Choices have consequences. And consequences arrive. Always. The music changed, and people began moving toward the stage for the evening program. I glanced toward the crowd. I should get back, I said. Callum nodded. Of course. For a brief moment we simply stood there. Two people who had once shared a life. Two people who had taken different paths. Two people who would never be husband and wife again. And yet somehow neither of us seemed angry anymore. Before leaving, I turned toward him one final time. I hope you are doing okay. His expression softened. I am. Then he smiled. Not perfect. I laughed. Nobody is. No. He shook his head. But I am better than I was. I believed him. And surprisingly, I was glad. Because despite everything, I had never wanted Callum destroyed. I had wanted him accountable. There is a difference. Accountability teaches. Destruction rarely does. As I walked back toward the crowd, I felt something settle quietly inside me that I recognized immediately because I had been waiting for it for a long time. Peace. Not because I had won, not because he had lost. Because the story was finally over and my life was fully, completely, irreversibly my own. The greatest revenge was never taking his money or watching his professional connections fade or seeing the fantasy he had built collapse around him. The greatest revenge was rebuilding my own life so completely that his betrayal no longer defined it. And the greatest lesson was even simpler than that. Never underestimate the quiet people who hold a family together. Never mistake loyalty for weakness. Never assume the people who support you will always remain there regardless of how you treat them. Because one day, they may simply stop carrying your weight. And when they do, you will discover exactly how much they were holding. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not retaliate. It is simply stop protecting someone from the consequences of their own choices, and then walk away with their dignity completely intact.